The Cost of Silence, the Espionage Act of 1917.
It's 1917, and the world is watching World War I unfold with bated breath. Millions of lives have already been lost in battle. With the death toll mounting higher and higher, Americans begin to fear for their lives. However, they believe that they'll be saved from the war. After all, recently re-elected President Woodrow Wilson now bears the responsibility of upholding his campaign promise to keep the U.S. out of the war, the pledge that won him the election.
Suddenly, an announcement from the Wilson administration rocks the nation. On April 6, 1917, not even 6 months after his re-election, President Wilson, facing potential threat from foreign nations, formally declares America's entry into the World War. The statement is plastered across the front page of every newspaper, sweeping the nation.
The populace is outraged and anti-war radicals rise up to protest. Citizens also begin to grow paranoid of spies from foreign nations, fueled by spy fiction, misinformation, and government propaganda. Congress decides to make an act that can both assuage people's fears and achieve their goal of pushing down anti-war dissent, killing 2 birds with 1 stone.
The Espionage Act of 1917 is passed by Congress and signed into action by President Wilson on June 15th, criminalizing any seditious activity against the country for the purposes of presenting a united front and silencing opposition to the war. It was highly criticized by Americans for violating the rights given by the First Amendment, despite the U.S. government's responsibility to protect them. In the short term, thousands were prosecuted unjustly, while today, parts of the act, such as Section 793, remain in place and continue to pose a threat to free speech and democracy in America.
Despite the name of the Espionage Act, it was not created with the sole purpose of criminalizing espionage within the states. Although Section 793 of the Act specifically barred the obtaining and spreading of information relating to the national defense, this term remained undefined, allowing the government to detain anyone who criticized U.S. involvement in the war for spreading information about the national defense. The act also forbade obstructing the draft and left the responsibility of finding sedition in people's letters to a single person, the Postmaster General.
The Wilson administration considered any critique of the government a danger to national unity, fearing that internal conflict would make the U.S. seem weak and vulnerable to enemy countries. In one of his addresses, President Wilson declared, "The thing I shall count upon, the thing without which neither counsel nor action will avail, is the unity of America, an America united in feeling and purpose." The Wilson administration used this argument of the importance of national unity to justify betraying their responsibility to the citizens of the United States. Even so, the Espionage Act didn't meet President Wilson's standards, and a series of amendments, collectively referred to as the Sedition Act, were passed less than a year later. The amendments forbade any and all criticism of the U.S. government, whether it was by letter, newspaper, or even word of mouth.
The Espionage Act and its amendments were a clear infraction upon the people's right to free speech, which is engraved within the First Amendment of the Constitution, the supreme law of America and the basis of American ideals. Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech. Despite knowing their responsibility to uphold the Constitution, the U.S. government still went through with the act and its subsequent amendments, sparking protests and anger.
One man, Senator Robert La Follette, strongly opposed the Espionage Act and its suppression of free speech. In an address following the act's passage in 1917, he told the president, "The right to control their own government according to constitutional forms is not one of the rights that the citizens of this country are called upon to surrender in time of war. I am contending, Mr. President, for the great fundamental right of the sovereign people of this country to make their voice heard." However, the senator's words went unheard as the Espionage Act was subsequently misused to arrest people and organizations who spoke out against the war, such as the Industrial Workers of the World, or the IWW, an all-inclusive labor union. The government, who had already been aiming to destroy the organization for its powerful voice in the American labor movement, claimed the group had ties with the German War Office. Over 100 IWW leaders were mass arrested starting September 1917, despite a lack of concrete evidence against the group. Hundreds more were deported.
The Espionage Act ended up crippling the entire labor organization so heavily it took decades to recover. Not only were many people too scared to join or return after the mass arrest, but the government raids on the IWW cost the organization hundreds of thousands of dollars.
There were two especially notable examples of individuals who are also targeted by the Espionage Act: Charles Xiong and Eugene Debs. Xiong was charged with obstructing the draft by passing out papers that encouraged resistance to enlisting. He appealed his conviction in 1919, arguing that because the law disregarded the government's responsibility to protect its citizens' freedom of speech, he could not be reasonably convicted under the act. However, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who oversaw his case, introduced the analogy of falsely shouting fire in a theater, clear and present danger, to justify the controversial act. He stated that if speech posed an immediate threat to other people, it was not protected under the Constitution. As a result, Xiong was sentenced to 10 years on March 3, 1919.
The metaphor would continue to be used to prosecute several more people, including Eugene Debs. He was the leader of the Socialist Party at the time and was fervently against the Espionage Act. On June 16, 1918, Debs gave a speech in Canton, Ohio to fellow anti-war activists, unaware of agents from the U.S. Department of Justice lurking in the crowd. Only 2 weeks later, he was arrested for unlawfully, willfully, and feloniously attempting to incite insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, and refusal of duty, although he never explicitly encouraged resistance to the draft. On the 10th of March, 1919, a week after the conclusion of Xiong v. U.S., Debs was found guilty and condemned to 10 years in prison.
Although he, like many others imprisoned under the Espionage Act, was released after the war ended, it was already too late. While Debs had been held in confinement, he contracted a disease that took his life 6 years after his release. Xiong and Debs were only two of over 2,000 people who were unjustly prosecuted and arrested under the Espionage Act. They all faced up to 20 years in prison and a fine of as much as $10,000, nearly $250,000 today.
But this wasn't the end of the Espionage Act's consequences. The act was further misused during the first Red Scare between 1919 and 1920, an era of fear and a crackdown on communism and left-wing activists the government wished to target. It gave the government a legal means of arresting those they disagreed with, whilst accusing them of being communists or radicals. Thousands of lives were ruined in the aftermath, with people being deported, arrested, and scapegoated. However, free speech protections have grown far stronger since. When O.M. Hartzell was charged under the Espionage Act in 1944, rather than siding with previous convictions under the Act, judges instead ruled in favor of the defendant. Later, in 1969, the clear and present danger test that prosecuted Xiong and Debs was deemed too vague to protect basic constitutional rights and was replaced with the imminent lawless action test. The definition of free speech in America had begun to evolve. Today, the First Amendment protects a much broader range of free speech, such as protesting wars in school. But although America has never been freer, the Espionage Act continues to repress rights within the country.
For example, Section 793, one of the most significant parts of the Act, has been utilized against whistleblowers such as Daniel Hale, who uncovered government-directed drone strikes in 2014 that killed hundreds of innocent Afghan civilians and classified them as enemies killed in action.
Sometimes, 9 out of 10 people killed are innocent. The thing I feared most was the temptation not to question it. So I contacted an investigative reporter and told him I had something the American people needed to know.
Hale was sentenced to 45 months in prison despite his valiant cause.
Hale's case is just one of many instances of the judiciary standing by the Espionage Act's repression of First Amendment rights in the United States. This has led to a push for the legislature to pass bills and amendments, such as the Espionage Act Reform Act and Amendment 759. These changes would restrict prosecution under the Act to individuals bound by U.S. government non-disclosure contracts, while preserving its use in cases of genuine espionage. But until Congress decides to uphold their constitutional responsibilities to protect their citizens' right to free speech, the Espionage Act will continue to lurk in the shadows of the American democracy. And until it is changed, America, the land of freedom, will never truly be free.